Good morning. Okay, so this morning I'm going to talk about being limited on everything. So how can you make sourdough if you don't already have a Dutch oven, or you only have a small stove, or you really don't have very much time? So my name is Sarah, and I started the Sourdough for Beginners group on Facebook. Last time I checked, it had close to 12,000 members, and almost everyone in the group is an absolute beginner. And I'm just starting to see lots of things come up over and over again. And of course, these are all things that came up for me when I was first a beginner. I started a page that's sort of a sister to the group. It's also called Sourdough for Beginners. If you just type @Sourdough for Beginners into Facebook, the page should come up. And I've typed out a whole bunch of tutorials and featured them all pinned at the top of the page. Our two most used tutorials are our beginner starter tutorial and our beginner bread recipe. The beginner bread recipe is a low hydration recipe, and low hydration recipes are much easier to deal with when you're a beginner. What low hydration means is that the percentage of water in comparison to the flour is lower. So we recommend that most people start with that recipe, practice it a whole bunch of times, get used to it, start to learn about all the different things that happen with sourdough, and then they can start moving into the higher hydration recipes, or the recipes that have mix-ins, or getting to be really good at scoring and all of that sort of thing. So this morning I've got some dough that was mixed 2 days ago, bulk proofed, shaped, and stuck in the fridge in loaf pans to cold proof. And cold proofing is almost like your second rise with bread. So if you have any experience with bread that's not sourdough, that's yeast based, you know that you mix it up, you let it rise, you shape it, and then you often let it rise a second time. The cold proof is almost like that. So I have preheated my oven to 450, and I've taken just a regular baking tray like this, filled it about half full to here or so. You can actually see the line from using it before, with water. And I've let the oven preheat long enough that the water that's in that water pan is now bubbling. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to pull my cold proof dough out of the fridge. I'm going to quickly score it. I'm going to stick it in the oven. I'm going to bake it for 25 minutes. And after 25 minutes, I'm just going to turn my pan 180 degrees and let it bake for another 20 minutes. After that 20 minutes, I'm going to pull my bread out, pop it out of the loaf pans, and just let it go back into the oven for 5 or 6 more minutes to crisp up the bottom. So the idea here is you've got the desire to make sourdough. You've got a starter, you have an oven, but you don't have a Dutch oven yet. You don't have a dough whisk. You don't have a proofing basket, a banneton. You don't have all of these things. Does that block you from doing sourdough? And what happened to me is that I had none of these things. I decided I was going to try anyway, and I figured out all kinds of ways to make it work. So I'm just going to show you my oven. So my oven is a tiny little apartment size oven. Its maximum temperature is only 450 degrees. And when I first started making sourdough, I felt like maybe I couldn't do it because all of the recipes called for preheating a Dutch oven to 500 degrees. I was gifted an amazing, fantastic, old German clay pot. And for a while, I was baking my bread in this, but I really love it. The person who gifted it to me, it was from somebody who was really special to them, and it felt like such an honor to get it. So I was baking my bread in this, but I noticed that over time it was starting to get cracks in it, and so I didn't want to do it anymore. That is an untreated clay pot, and I really think that if you're going to do a Dutch oven style bake, then you really need to have either an enamel covered steel or a cast iron. So I convinced Amazon to let me start up an ideas list, and I've posted the link to both the beginner bread tutorial as well as the Amazon idea list. And that idea list I've been building over the last few days. People in the group have been making suggestions as to tools that they use and how they would use them and everything else. So if you want to buy all of the tools right away and get started with sourdough, it's going to make your life easier. It's definitely going to make you see quicker success. So I definitely recommend you do those things. But in the meantime, you can start to practice. So I'm going to grab my bread out of the fridge. I'm going to score it. I'm going to get it in the oven. And then I'm going to talk about a starter that's past its peak and taking the beginner bread recipe that is in the Sourdough for Beginners tutorials page and halving it so that you only make one loaf. And possibly maybe we'll look at some doughs that are ready to be shaped and put in the fridge to cold proof. So what am I limited on today? I'm limited on time. It's 8:15 here in Ontario. I have to leave by 9:30. My daughter has appointments and it's shopping day. I'm also very limited on flour. I think there might be about 400 grams here. So I'm going to show you how you can blend some flours to make things stretch. So let me get my bread. So this is a full batch of the beginner bread tutorial that's on the Sourdough for Beginners page on Facebook, split into 2 loaves. So I'm just going to turn it down here. So when you bake the beginner's batch, you end up with enough dough to make 2 approximately 900 gram loaves. So these were mixed a couple of days ago. They were allowed to bulk proof. They were pre-shaped and then shaped. And then I put them in these loaf pans to cold proof in the fridge. And now I'm going to, I guess you could technically call it an open bake, but they're going to be in the loaf pans in the oven. So the loaf pans are wonderful because they act like a Benetton and keep your shape while you're cold proofing, but then you can also bake your bread in the oven. So I have these very technical, handy dandy elastic things that my stepdaughter made for me to hold my high-end saran wrap on top of my dough while it cold proofs. A lot of people use shower caps. They just buy a pack of 100 shower caps and pop those on to cover it while it's in the fridge. And then I have this one that we rigged up. It's hair elastics. All right, so I'm going to score these. I use a little bit of rice flour. The reality is that with an open bake, you lose most of your rice flour. You don't necessarily get that, deep white that you see happen in some of the other baking, but I put it on just the same. So I'm just going to sprinkle it on top of my loaves fairly generously. I'm going to gently rub it in. A little more. Do this one. So I'm being gentle. I don't want to degas my loaves. I've taken them straight out of the fridge. I haven't let them come to room temperature. Now I'm going to score them. So the purpose of scoring, your sourdough's got all kinds of, you've built this nice tension when you've shaped. You've got all this nice moisture in there. And in order for the bread to spring and get that nice bubbly, lovely look inside the sourdough that we're all looking for, some of the steam needs to escape. And as it escapes, the bread springs up. So we score. In order to score, you need a knife or a razor blade. When I first started, I was just sharpening my knife every time and using that. But I had bought my husband a straight razor kit a few years ago, and we tried it, and it felt way too dangerous to be putting this near his face. And I remembered that we had them, so at first I went and stole just one of his razors, and I was using this, and then I remembered that he had this. I've seen people use X-Acto knives, anything that's sharp, like a razor. So this is what I'm using. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to score about 2/3 of the way from the left, and I'm going to try and grab about a 45-degree angle and just score in a curved shape down my bread. And with my main score, I like to go over it twice, like this. So same thing here. And I'll go over it again. The beginner sourdough recipe is a very stiff recipe, low hydration, so you don't see the bread, you know, jiggling or spreading, but this is what makes it so much more forgiving for a beginner. I'm just going to put some cosmetic scores over here for looks, like just like a little wheat stalk sort of thing. Good. Okay, so I'm just going to take a regular cookie tray, and I'm going to put my loaf pans on top of my cookie tray. Remember that I've got a tray of water on the bottom rack of my stove, and my middle rack is ready for my bread. With my oven, what I do is I just mist some water in right when I put the bread in. And then I also mist some water in every 7 or 8 minutes or so for the first 25 minutes. So I'm just gonna see, maybe we can see what's going in. So I'm just gonna pop this in the stove. Gonna give it some mist. And I'm gonna note the time, 8:22. So at 8:47, I'm going to rotate that 180 degrees. Okay, so now let's talk about limited supplies and starter. Let me just show you my starter. So this is my main starter. Her name's Mama. I did a live yesterday, and during that live she was at peak. This is a fantastic starter. People are always asking, when do I use my starter? You know, well, number one, when you're first establishing it, you can't use your starter until it's doubling consistency within 4 to 6 hours every single day. And I'll do a whole starter live another day. But at what point do you use your starter when it is established? You should, if you can, try to use your starter at peak. And you will get good at being able to time that peak. So if you know your starter doubles in about 4 hours, then technically you could feed your starter 4 hours before you were going to bake, and then you would know that it would be ready. This starter got fed yesterday. I mixed up a loaf, and I want to just do a little bit of a loaf today. It's under peak. I found with my starter that because of the fact that it's fed and used every day, I can use it really anytime after peak, even if it's fallen. I don't really know if I get better results. I'm sure there's lots of science as to why I would, but I'm just going to use it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to mix a half loaf of the beginner bread tutorial that's on the Sourdough for Beginners page. I'm very low on flour. I think there's only about 400 grams. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take 60 grams out of this flour to make sure I still have enough flour left over to feed my starter after I've used it. Wow, this is really low. Let's just make ourselves some room. I like buying these ginormous bags of flour, but I don't love sticking my arm all the way to the bottom, so I keep cutting it as I go. Okay, so we're going to measure out 60 grams so that we have flour to feed our starter when we're done. And I'm just going to set that aside. Okay, so the beginner bread recipe calls for 120 grams of starter, 680 grams of water, and a total of 1,000 grams of flour and 20 grams of salt. And lots of people ask me, well, can I just make one loaf? Of course you can. You just literally half it. So we're going to take 60 grams of starter. my starter is set up to have 120 grams come out every day and be fed a new 120 grams, 60 grams each of water and starter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put 60 grams in this loaf, and I'm going to put 60 grams in my discard jar that I keep in the fridge, and I use that for discard recipes. I'm just going to show you. Even though it's not at peak anymore, it's still bubbly and very alive, but you can see it's quite watery. So if you watched my live yesterday, you would have seen that my starter was very stiff and I had to really coax it out. Today, I'm going to be able to just pour. So I'm looking for 60 grams of starter. It's like yogurt or buttermilk even. Okay. So again, having limited tools, lots of people have really special starter jars. I've got my eye on these nice glass ones that have measuring things on the side, and they've got like a nice spatula. I've popped them into the idea list on Amazon that's linked in the live. I imagine that this Christmas, all I'm getting for Christmas is sourdough tools for my whole family, because that's all we've lived for ever. But in the meantime, this plastic jar it's a pickle jar, and this regular kitchen knife are serving me fine. So I'll feed this starter after I mix this dough. So I've got 60 grams of starter. I need half of 680 grams of water, so 340 grams of water. And I mentioned this yesterday, this is just tap water. In Ontario here, we live right next to the lake. We're on a well. Our water has a filtration system downstairs, so I guess technically it could be filtered water, but it's filled with minerals. It's excellent. Lots of people ask, do I have to use filtered water? Or can I use this kind of water? I think the first thing you do is try your tap water, and if it works, then you're golden. If it doesn't, then you have to adjust and figure it out. Okay, so we've got 340 grams of water and 60 grams of starter. And I'm just going to use my trusty standard kitchen whisk to blend them together. I have to blend a lot less than yesterday because my starter wasn't at peak and stiff. It's come down and is watery. But like I said, I think that sourdough can be super laid back, and part of the fun is figuring out what works and what doesn't. So now I need 500 total grams of flour, which is half of the 1,000. I'm almost out of all-purpose, so I'm going to see how much is in here and go from there. Okay, so that brought me to a total of 267 grams of flour. So all I'm going to do now is just top it off with whole wheat flour. Now I do say for beginners that I don't often recommend that you go over 20% of the sturdier flours, but in this case I'm out, so I'm just going to make what I have work. Sturdier flours like whole wheat, rye flour, spelt flour, sprouted grains, all of these flours that are less processed than your standard all-purpose or bread flour. Change the consistency of your bread. They do all sorts of things. And they each have their own things that need to be managed. For example, I find that whole wheat flour tends to proof much, much faster than all of the other flours. So when you're a beginner, I recommend that you stay with a bread flour with just a small percentage or none of these other flours. But in my case, I'm out, so I'm just going to do it. So I'm just going to top myself up to 500 grams. Okay, And then today it's a half loaf, so I just need 10 grams of salt, and I'm just gonna pour until I get 10 grams. There we go. So I like to just sort of use my spoon to blend the flours on top of the water before I start mixing. Flour and salt, all the different kinds, start to get mixed together. And then I use my spoon to start stirring, and I keep using the spoon until the flour has absorbed most of the water, and then I finish my mix with my hands. So I mentioned I'm short on time today. I have to leave in an hour. Normally, I would spend 2 to 2.5 hours stretch and folding this dough, but there's a couple of things here. This is whole wheat flour. It tends to proof much quicker than other flours, so it might not need quite as much strength. But worst case scenario, if I feel like I haven't built enough strength, I'm just going to stick it in the fridge, pause it, leave it there until I get home from my errands today, and then I'll pull it out and I'll stretch and fold it some more and let it finish bulk proofing on the counter. Now, are these the most traditional ways to mix sourdough? No. Are these the most scientific ways to mix sourdough? No. Are there very specific ways and advanced techniques that you can use to mix sourdough? Absolutely. But my focus has really become, how can we make it so that anybody can make sourdough? And so this is what we're doing. So I'm just going to mix up this dough until all of the flour is absorbed and it's nice and shaggy. As you can see, it's starting to come together. I'm just going to hand my husband the coffee maker, coffee curd.
Oh no, I'm okay.
Here we go. All right. So it's sticky, but it's not too sticky. And this is why I recommend that beginners start with a very low hydration recipe, because it's much easier to work with. The higher hydration recipes will get you, a much lighter and squishier bread. And obviously that's where we want to get. But first, we need to get comfortable with actually working with the dough and the bread and everything else. Now, because I know that I have to leave and I'm not going to get as many stretch and folds in as I normally would, in this initial mix, I'm going to go a little farther than I did yesterday. Yesterday I said, just mix it up quick, even if there's a little bit of dry spots here and there, don't worry, those come out in the stretch and fold. But today we're focusing on, we're limited on everything. We're limited on time, we're limited on supplies, and we're limited on tools. So let's just make it work. Okay, so that's mixed. I'm going to leave it sitting for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'm going to do a stretch and fold. So I'm going to rush the stretch and fold process just a little bit. I don't have my cover on super tight. I've just got it covered for now. I'm going to rinse my hands. Okay, so our bread went in at 8:22. It's 8:35. Got about 12 more minutes before we flip it. We'll see if we can take a look at it. Looks like it's doing okay for now, but I'm just going to give it a quick mist with my mist bottle. So I'm not misting on top of the bread because that'll make it so that we lose our, not misting on top of the bread because that will make it so that we lose our flour that we put on top. But the mist does help it spring. So now I'm going to feed my starter. So I said before that my starter, every day I need to take 120 grams out of it, but today I ran out of flour, so I only mixed a half batch of the beginner bread tutorial, which means I only took 60 grams of starter out. And so in order to feed it, I need to get another 60 grams out. So this is my discard jar, very fancy, Kraft peanut butter. I cleaned it up nice, scrubbed it really good, got all of the soap and rinsed it really well. And I just saved my discard in here. And I use my discard in recipes. The brown butter chocolate chip cookies that are on the internet and have gone viral recently are very popular, but there's all kinds of things that we can make. So I'm just gonna tear this to 0, and I'm gonna measure 60 grams out of my starter into my discard. So here we go. Okay. So there we go. I'm just going to stick my discard jar back in the fridge. I try to go through this within 10 days. You can see it's getting high. That's usually a trigger to me that tomorrow or later this afternoon I need to start doing some discard baking. I don't know how long it lasts. I don't know how long it stays good, but I figure if I can go through it in 10 days and then clean my jar and start again, then I'm probably not poisoning my family. So far, no one's gotten sick. All right, so we'll feed our starter. Starter jar. So we see this all the time. I keep a sealed lid on my starter. I don't like the idea of fruit flies in my house. It drives me nuts, and fruit flies are attracted to fermentation. And I believe that the only bacteria that our starter really needs is the bacteria that it creates itself. And so by putting a sealed lid in, it's not letting any external bacteria from the environment in. All right, so I had pre-measured this 60 grams earlier because I was worried about running out of flour. So I'm just going to dump this in. And now I'm going to put 60 grams of water in. And I'm going to mix it up. So this is the pancake batter that people are talking about. I don't know. I like thin pancakes. My pancakes tend to be a little bit thinner than this. And this is the kind of thing that gets confusing when you're a beginner. It's like pancake batter. Like, do you mean like my grandma's pancakes or my mom's pancakes? For me, I think your better bet is just to watch your starter. If your starter is doubling within 4 to 6 hours consistently every day, then you're doing perfectly. If you're getting, like liquid, grayish sort of liquid on top of your starter every day, that's hooch. Hooch means hungry. Increase your flour a little bit, right? But ultimately, over time, you'll start to get a feel. So, starter's done. I'm going to pop the lid on. My elastic that marks its height kind of stays everywhere, but I'm just going to show you what I normally do with my starter. So I will use, so my oven has, I'll show you, my little tiny apartment size oven that initially would make someone think that maybe I can't do starter, vents out of here. It's not super hot, but there's definitely a lot of warmth. So I've got a dough right here that I'd like to shape, that I wanted to proof just a little bit more. So I've got it sitting here beside the oven, soaking up some of the warmth. My starter tends to live there, especially on weeks when I know that I'm baking every day. And what'll happen is I'll leave at 9:30 this morning and come back, and it'll have definitely doubled. So I'm just gonna stick it there. So 822, 32, 42. We're looking for 847, and then we're gonna rotate our bread. So we'll have a sip of our coffee. So this is a full batch. of the beginner sourdough recipe that I mixed up yesterday. I mixed this dough. It's about 17 or 18% spelt. The rest is a mix of bread flour and all-purpose flour. I spent a couple of hours stretching and folding. I did 4 altogether. I built some good strength and structure into these doughs, and then I pushed them down into my clear straight-sided containers. Now on the Amazon idea list, I actually found like a restaurant grade square container that's got measures all on it. And so, you know, if you want to start getting tools, this is what you would do. But for me right now, I'm just using every Tupperware that I have, and I'm taking my dough once it's been stretched and folded, pushing it down into one of these and marking its height. So if you look at this one, you can see that when I put it in, it was kind of all over the place, right? There were voids. This would have been a void. Here it was like this. So when you look at this dough, you can see now that it's risen, it's become nice and flat. And this is another thing that's hard as a beginner, is people say, oh, well, wait for your dough to double or wait for it to get to 75%. But it's hard to know, right? It's hard to remember. Sometimes we're talking 4, 6, 8 hours. Sometimes we're talking the next day if we stuck it in the fridge. How do you really know if it's doubled? And so this has become my handy dandy foolproof way. You can see this one had a big void here, and there was a big void here. There was no dough at all. That's why my marker comes down like that. I literally just take my Sharpie marker and trace it. So I'm happy with how much these have grown. You can also see that the dough is starting to get a little bit of a dome in it. It's starting to be higher in the center and stick to the sides. So while I'm waiting to rotate my bread that's in the oven, I'm going to pre-shape these. And then I'm going to get these shaped and pop them in the fridge to cold proof. So let's do some pre-shaping. So again, a lot of people use shower caps when they're cold proofing in the fridge. My adorable stepdaughter made me these. I think they were supposed to be a necklace, but as you can see, they were strangling me, and then I figured out that they fit my dough perfectly. So, if you look here, and if you look at this one, so you can see that lots of proofing has happened. Nice and bubbly, nice and rounded on top. So, when you watch videos on Facebook, you see people take their dough and flip it upside down and it just falls out. With the beginner bread recipe, it's a much sturdier dough. I usually end up having to coax it out with my hand. And then let's also talk about more tools. So one tool that people often talk about is a bench scraper. You've seen them, I'm sure. If not, they're in the idea list that's on Amazon. But the bench scraper helps you to build tension in your bread, cut your bread, or get your bread into sizing. It's an excellent tool. They're reasonably inexpensive, but I just didn't order one. So what I use is just a dull, inexpensive knife as my bench scraper. So I don't know if you can see, but the dough's starting to fall out of here. I'm an impatient person. Normally I would be holding this up and pulling it out with my hand. So I'm just gonna do that. Okay, so there we go. And then that marker, even though it's a Sharpie, just comes off when I wash the dishes. Okay, so here's our dough. We're gonna pre-shape it, let it sit, and then final shape it, and then put it in the fridge for cold proofing. So when we pre-shape, all we're doing is building an initial amount of tension into the dough. So I'm sure you've seen videos where they've got a bench scraper and they just sort of zip around and get it going. I just use my knife, and all I do is I try to support it with my hand, but you don't touch it too hard, otherwise your hand will stick, right? So I'm just lightly supporting it with my hand, I start at the top and I do a turn. Get it off and turn. And all I'm doing here is just building up some tension. So as you can see, it's starting to come into itself. It's starting to look smooth. If you could feel it, it's starting to get sort of dry on top. All right, now we'll do this one. I'm right-handed, so I'm actually just gonna move this over and do this here. So we're at 8:46. It's almost time for me to turn that bread. And I can see that my bread is already starting to spring. I don't know if you're gonna be able to see it when I turn it, but you might be able to. I'm just gonna leave this dough sitting here to fall out of its container, and I'm gonna take you over here. Let's see if we can make it so you can see it. My oven has a very bright light in it, and I've tried pointing my camera at it in the past, but I haven't had a ton of luck. But let's see. Let's see what we can do here. Okay. So it's been about 25 minutes. I'm just gonna take my bread. I'm gonna rotate the pan 180 degrees just to make sure that it's getting evenly cooked. So here's my water that I talked about. It's bubbling. We're at 450 degrees. Here's my bread. And as you can see, I don't know if you can, but we're starting to get a good ear here. So we're starting to get some decent spring. So I'm just gonna turn this, slide it back in. Maybe I'll give it a little bit of a mist one last time. And I mist down here underneath. And now I'm gonna leave it for 20 minutes. So we are at 8:48. So that's gonna put us at 9:08. So let's come back up here. All right, so we'll just get organized again. And we'll start working on shaping this bread. Okay. So we've got this one pre-shaped, and we're gonna pre-shape this one. So again, I don't have a bench scraper. This is a stiff dough. If I was more patient, it would just fall out of the container, but I'm not, so I'm just gonna coax it out with my fingers. And my marks that I made yesterday will just come off in when we wash the dishes. So, again, I'm gonna use my makeshift bench scraper. But like I said, if you wanted a real bench scraper, I've put them in that Amazon ideas list. So the group members in the Sourdough for Beginners group on Facebook, a whole bunch of them have actually looked at that Amazon ideas list and sent me ideas to add. There's tools in there that I didn't even know existed. So definitely, if you want to check that out and let me know if there's stuff that I should add to the list, put it in the comments. I would love to hear, because like I said, I'm just starting to figure out how this Amazon idea list works right now. So I've built some tension, smoothed out my dough. You can see this one's already starting to settle. We're just gonna let these sit for a little while, and then we're going to shape them. So remember, I'm very short on time. So this is the dough that I just mixed. And I'm gonna rush the stretch and fold process a little bit. So I'm going to give this a stretch and fold. As you can see, it's coming apart. It's not holding together. It needs more strength built into it. And this is why we stretch and fold so many times. So when we're stretch and folding our dough, what we're doing is we're building strength. Building strength is a big thing in sourdough. We can build strength in our starter. We can build strength in our dough. So here, as I stretch and fold, you can see that it's starting to hold together more. When I did that first stretch and fold, it basically, like I tried to come up really high and it tore, right? But as I continue to do the stretch and folding and build strength into this dough, move it around, you'll see that it starts to hold together more and become one. All right. So put that there. I'm going to rinse my hand. Okay. Let's refill our coffee. Okay, so far, we've pulled cold proof dough out of the fridge that was stored in loaf pans that almost acted as bannetons, and popped that into the oven at 450 degrees. We're on our second run now of 20 minutes, which is going to end at 9:08. We have mixed a half-size beginner bread tutorial mix with almost 50% whole wheat because I was running out of flour. We have made do without a dough whisk. We've made do without a Dutch oven. We've made do without a banneton. We have pre-shaped our dough that's about to go into the cold proof. We've made do without a bench scraper. I just want to say, having these tools actually makes things easier for you, right? I have nothing against getting them. My real focus is that I believe that anybody can make sourdough and that it can be fun and simple. And so I'm really focused on the beginner and trying to get the beginner started. So we have a little bit of a lull. So let's talk about shaping this and getting it ready for cold proofing. So a lot of people have bannetons. They are a basket that is lined with linen or cotton, and generally what they will do with their dough is they will pre-shape it, shape it, put it seam side down inside the banneton. The banneton will be well floured, and then they'll cover it with a banneton cover or a shower cap or saran wrap, whatever it may be. I don't have that. So what am I going to do? I'm going to use these Tupperware containers as a banneton. Also, the beginner sourdough recipe is very low hydration and very stiff, so it doesn't lose a lot of its elasticity while it's cold proofing. I'm not going to go seam down. Or seam up. I'm going to go seam down, and I'm just going to use my parchment as a sling. So tomorrow when I bake these, I'm going to bake them in the same loaf pans that I'm using in the oven right now. So I'm just going to grab my parchment paper, pick them up out of here, these containers that they're cold proofing in, and plunk them right into my loaf pans. So these are going to act as makeshift bannetons for makeshift loaf pan sourdough. So we've pre-shaped, we're letting it rest, we're letting it sort of spread. And now what we're going to do is we're going to get ready to shape the bread. So first of all, you see that okay? Yes. I want to get some parchment paper ready. And I want my parchment paper to be wide enough to stick down inside my bannetons. I'm super excited. Today's grocery day. I'm out of almost everything. So when we shape our dough, we're going to shape it on a floured surface. I just use rice flour. Any flour will do. We're going to go under the edge of our dough. We're going to lift it straight up and flip it. We're going to flatten it out. We're going to shape it nice. And then we're going to lift it onto floured parchment paper. And then once it's on the floured parchment paper, we're going to sling it into our Tupperware containers, cover them, put them in the fridge to cold proof. So I'm going to flour up my parchment paper. I like to use lots. When the bread is cold proofing in the fridge, a bunch of moisture comes out and it can get sticky. So if you've used a good amount of flour, especially rice flour, then you should be okay. And I'm gonna flour my surface. Keep that right there. Have a sip of coffee because it's morning. Look at my bread. Oh, it's springing. I'm super excited. One of the most nerve-wracking things about going live on Facebook is, what if my bread doesn't work? I've got enough experience now that usually it works, and I've actually practiced this method with no tools and the loaf pan enough times that I'm afraid to do anything else, honestly. But still, yesterday I tried baking actually twice this week I tried baking a high hydration recipe that I use all the time, and both times, they were horrible. Let me show you. I was so frustrated. The recipe didn't change, but the method did. I was trying to open bake them on my stones, which I have had success doing with the beginner sourdough recipe, the low hydration one, but I was trying to open bake high hydration loaves on my stones in my oven, and God, they didn't rise. They didn't get an ear. They're very dense, and I was super frustrated. So here it is. No ear, hardly any rise, giant holes. It's like, so my family's gonna have, I'm not just talking one loaf either, I'm talking two. Plus another one. That was even worse, that I threw away. We all make mistakes sometimes. And now my family's gonna have months and months worth of croutons. Oh my goodness. Okay, back to shaping. We've got about 10 minutes until we need to do the next thing with our bread that's baking. So let's get this shaped. So we've pre-shaped it with our bench scraper or our knife, okay? And now we're gonna get it ready to shape to go into cold proofing. So I'm just gonna get my fingers underneath. It's very sticky. We don't need wet hands or anything. We just need to handle it gently and as little as possible. I'm gonna pick it straight up. I'm gonna flip it over onto the flour. Let's move this over here. I'm gonna stretch it out a little. Right. I'm gonna make a pamphlet. So I'm gonna fold the bottom section up. We're trying to be fairly gentle here, so we're not pushing really hard. There's gas and air in here. That's what creates our bubble structure. So don't push too hard, but push it enough so that it's going to stay, right? Now, at this point, you can just roll it and shape it. I like to sort of bring these ends in like this. This part's not necessary, but I like to make the bread bind wherever I can get it to bind. So now I'm going to roll it, right? Now we've got our loaf. Now I'm going to cover my hands in flour. And I'm going to shape it. So all I'm doing here is just gently, with well-floured hands, starting to shape. Because I'm not going to go seam side up with this one, I'm just starting to shape the bread under itself. Very gently. It's starting to get bubbles on top. I'm not sure if you can see those. I do not pop them. I don't. I love them. That's what's going to make your blisters when you cook your bread. Right. Just going to scoop up some flour. I'm just going to gently shape this until it's sort of all come underneath itself. Now, I like to make mine a little bit of an oblong loaf. Maybe someday we'll talk about the different kinds of loaves. A round one is a boule, an oblong one is a batard. Now I'm going to put it on my parchment paper. And I'm going to use my parchment paper as a sling. I'm going to set it in my container. And I usually just fold my parchment paper around the edges, push it away from the bread wherever I can. So that's my makeshift banneton. And then I'm just going to reuse my saran wrap from this morning. It was a little bit damp. I usually just put the damp side up. I don't reuse this too much, but a couple times. No sense in wasting. My handy dandy elastics. Put this on. Make sure all of our edges are secured. It's kind of sticking out there. And there we go. So this is going to go in the fridge and cold proof. Cold proofing is an optional step, but it's like it's the second rise, right? So you've mixed your dough, you've built strength in it by stretch and folding, you've bulk fermented it, so you've just let it rise all on its own and do its own thing. Now you've pre-shaped your dough, you've started teaching your dough that you want it to have some tension, some bubbles, some air, right? You've created elasticity. You've got your loaf shaped. You could technically at this point put your bread right in the oven. But a cold proof allows it to continue to develop more structure. And they say that when you cold proof, that's how you get more flavor. So again, I'm being gentle with this, but I am stretching it a little. So make a pamphlet gently. Just get it to stick. Like to bring in my edges here, but see those nice bubbles? Oh, I'm excited. Those end up in our loaf. Okay. And now we're just going to roll. Now this is where I flour up my hands. Might as well scoop it up because it has to be clean, doesn't it? I think by the time I'm done this live, because the bread's going to turn at 9:08 and then it's going to crisp up for another 5 minutes, I'm going to have to run out the door and leave this mess to clean later. So again, I'm just gently building tension. I'm not squishing. I'm not being rough. I'm letting this bread push these bubbles up, get this nice dry skin on top. All right, so again, I'll show you. This is a batard, nice and round. Or no, this is a boule, sorry, nice and round. This is starting to be a batard when we're going rectangular. I just shaped mine rectangular because I'm using loaf pans. So onto the parchment, into our sling, our makeshift banneton, sorry. Use our parchment as a sling and get it into our makeshift banneton. And grab some saran wrap. Sorry, my husband just scared the life out of me. We're going to talk about that later. My husband just snuck up behind me and scared the life out of me. I'm sorry for that scream. Oh my goodness. I can hear him snickering still. He'll pay for that, don't worry. He's killing himself laughing in the other room. I'm embarrassed. Okay, here we go. So we've got our saran wrap, our trusty saran wrap folders. Very technical. And again, this is just going to go into the fridge to cold proof. I'll bake them in the morning. Okay, so we have a minute. 9:08. We're going to take our loaf pans out of the oven. I'm going to take the bread out of the loaf pan, flatten out the parchment paper, put them just on the tray, and let them sit in the oven for 5 to 9 minutes just to brown up the base. You'll see what I mean when I pull it out. But our dough that we are rushing, because I'm short on time, we're going to give it another bit of a stretch and fold. So let's see. Are you over here? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to wet our hand, right? We're going to grab our dough. We're going to pull it up. It's starting to hold together. At the last stretch and fold, I'm not sure if you noticed, but that first pull up, it ripped, right? This is the thing. We're building strength, right? So underneath, you'll hear people say north, south, east, west. So stretch and fold 4 times on all sides, right? And you'll notice during the stretch and fold process, it'll start to stretch less. These are all indicators of strength. So what's going to end up happening with this dough is I'm going to have to leave. So I'm going to end up sticking it in the fridge and letting it sort of start to bulk ferment. And when I get home, I'm going to look at it. And if it doesn't look like it's strong enough, if it doesn't feel like it's strong enough, I'll pull it out of the fridge, stretch and fold it a little bit more, and then let it continue bulk proofing on the counter, because later this afternoon, once I get home, I'll be home for the rest of the day. So we'll cover that back up. I'm just going to wash my hands. I'm sure that my husband really hopes that you all enjoyed that scare. He does stuff like that to me all the time. If you weren't on and didn't see it, rewind a minute or two, you'll see it. Okay, 9:06. We've got 2 minutes till we have to action our bread that's in the stove. This is a really good opportunity to do a little bit of cleaning. I go through sponges like this like crazy because they get covered in flour all the time, and the flour turns into glue and you can never get it off. But it is what it is. They're reasonably inexpensive. So clean my scale. This scale is actually in the Amazon list that I have. I love it. It's like, I think it was $9.98 on Amazon Basics. Like, how do you even not do that? So it's got tons of options. It's got grams, pounds and ounces, mils. It's really great. I've heard that when the battery starts getting low, the scale can start to become inaccurate. So I've promised myself that I'll pay attention to the battery. But if I don't, then I guess I'll just end up with a weird mix, and who knows how long it'll take me to figure it out. So we'll just tidy up a little. Okay, 9:08. So I'm making loaf pan bread, and I want it to be a little bit browned. So just gonna make some room here and show you how I get my bread to brown up just a little. Let's come over a little closer. Here we go. So here are my loaves. I'm going to close my oven so I don't lose heat. Look at these. Look at that ear. Oh, I'm so excited. It's so beautiful. And it's the beginner recipe. It's low hydration. There's no Dutch oven. There's nothing. It's cooked. It had no Bannaton. It's just cooked in a loaf pan. And look, I'm so excited. Okay, so what I do is I pull these loaves, or tip them out of the loaf pans. As you can see, they aren't very well cooked on the bottom. I stick them on the loaf pan or on the cookie tray that I was cooking on top of. I like to just pull the parchment off to loosen it up. Yowzers, that's hot. Okay. I'm going to stick these back in the oven for 5 to 8 minutes just to get them to brown. That's the only point. There we go. Okay, so we'll get rid of these. This clay Dutch oven, I just want to show it to you. It's really beautiful. So this is a Schlemmertopf. I know for a fact there's people in the group who are from German. I would love to actually hear the pronunciation, but I'm going to try Canadian style. Schlemmertopf. This belonged to somebody who I really love and respect's mother. She gifted it to me. I was using it for sourdough bread, But this is an unglazed clay pot. And these pots, you're supposed to soak them for an hour and then preheat them in the oven, just like a Dutch oven, in order to keep them from cracking. I really think that these unglazed clay pots are meant for meats and roasts and things that have juices, and then those juices absorb into the pot and make it better over time. I was using it for sourdough bread as a Dutch oven, but I started to notice some hairline cracks in it, and I really love it so much, so I stopped using it, and that's what resulted in me ending up using loaf pans. That Amazon ideas list that I posted the link for has several different Dutch ovens in it, and I want them all. But you know, we're just gonna keep on going until we get these things. Okay, so we're waiting a few minutes now. Like I said, we're short on time, so we're rushing this loaf. So I'm just going to try and give it another stretch and fold, even though it's only been a couple of minutes since we did that last one. I will tell you, it is so nice to see a good ear and a nice loaf after you have a couple of fails. I had 2 fails in a row with high hydration bread this week, and I was so disappointed. So here's the dough that we mixed. You can see it's still quite shaggy. There's still kind of lots of, I guess you could call those striations in there. When I stretch, it's not ripping, so that's good. It's staying together. It's starting to get strength. Starting to hold together. Still quite sticky, of course, but less sticky than a high hydration loaf. So, because I have to go, my daughter has an appointment at 10 o'clock and we live in the country, so we have to leave on time. She's got a friend sleeping over and they don't want to be late. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this mix that I made and I'm going to stick it in the fridge. I'll be home, I don't know, around 3 or so today. It will have proofed a little bit in the fridge. The fridge does not stop proofing. It slows it significantly. I'll look at it at that time and I'll decide if I need to stretch and fold it. So normally, if I've stretch and folded it enough, when it's ready to bulk proof, I would mark its height. So today, I'm just going to do that, just so that when I get home, I have an idea of what's happened with the bread. So I'm just going to push this in to my container. I really think that this could have used more stretch and folds, but this is what sourdough is all about, is just trial and error. Okay. Push that in. I'm just going to rinse my hands and get my marker. Bread is browning up nicely. I might rotate it just to get it browned on all sides. So lid on. So you can see there's kind of voids sort of all over the place. I'm just going to take my marker. Can you see? Yeah. And mark its height. There we go. When I get home today, when I pull it out of the fridge, I'll be able to see if it started to proof at all. You know, I'll take a look at it. I'll see how it looks. Why did my my high hydration loaves fail? So I showed you these. They're just in a grocery bag now because when I get some time, I'm going to slice it all up and make croutons with it. This is what I do with my fails. So this is a very high hydration loaf. The crumb actually isn't terrible, but a couple of things. I rushed this loaf. I rushed the bulk proof on this loaf. I was looking at it. I knew it hadn't risen enough, but I really wanted to try. And I didn't do a cold proof, which would have helped to get rid of those big giant bubbles. A lot more proofing with this bread would have been extremely helpful, but I rushed, and so that's what it is. I also rushed my stones. So what I was trying to do was open bake these on these stones. I'll show them to you. So I have these pieces of rock. My husband is in stone construction, and I stole this from him. This is flagstone. And I took a hammer and just kind of made it about the size of a piece of bread. I did not let these preheat enough. These need, if you're gonna bake on a stone, I would say you probably need to preheat that stone for at least 2 hours, unless you've got a stove that can get to really high temperatures. But the maximum temperature that my stove says it gets to is 450, and I doubt that it maintains 450. So I know exactly what happened with these. I'm both embarrassed and aggravated because I really wanted to eat this bread. But it is what it is. It is what it is. We all make mistakes sometimes. So I'm just trying to wait long enough until this bread is browned to come out so that you can see it when it's done. I'll clean up a little. Starting to get there. Just about there. Times are never exact. Everybody's stove is different. You have to go by trial and error for times. You know, I think people get into sourdough and they realize that there's all sorts of things to learn, and I think it's important not to get hung up on any of that stuff. I think it's important to, you know, pay attention to what's working best for you. Standard timing is if you have a Dutch oven, you put the Dutch oven in the stove, you preheat the stove with the Dutch oven in it at 500 degrees. You let it preheat for as long as you can, at least a half an hour, at least until the Dutch oven is like fully immersed with heat. You pop your bread into the hot Dutch oven, and then you cook it for 20 to 25 minutes with the lid on. You take it out, you take the lid off, you cook it for another 15 to 25 minutes. When you take the lid off, you might leave the temperature at 500, you might reduce it to 450. You know, there's just a million different ways you can do it. And I think that as a beginner, the funnest part is trying all the different things and finding, you know, what works best for you. And then it's like a lottery when you get that perfect loaf. Okay. I am out of time. I have to leave this house in 10 minutes. So it's just over. So let's pull this out and hope that they're browned enough. Here we go. Just gonna shut this off. Not too shabby. Water tray out, let it cool, turn off my oven, I know you probably want to see the crumb shot, but I'm sorry. You can't because I am going to let this cool for an hour. More, because I'm going out. Here. Let's see. I wonder if I can bring these up. Look at that beautiful ear. Isn't it lovely? Okay, thanks everyone. Just one last thing, I'm Sarah. I run the Sourdough for Beginners group on Facebook. Last time I checked, there was about 12,000 members and growing, so we're really having a lot of fun in that group. We're all learning together. I created the Sourdough for Beginners Facebook page where I built all of these tutorials. I featured them and pinned them at the top of the Facebook page, so if you want to find the tutorials on starter, the beginner bread recipe, we've got discussions on overproofing, underproofing. There's lots of stuff in there. Give that page a follow. Thank you very much for watching. And oh, that was the other thing. Check out the Amazon list. Let me know what else I should add to it in the comments. And if you think I missed anything or if you've got any questions throughout the day, I check Facebook. Last time I did a live, there were so many comments and I appreciated them so much. Okay, bye.